If you're operating in environments where uncertainty actually matters, then please subscribe to the channel. I publish these briefings for decision makers, not for headlines. In January 2026, US forces carried out one of the most consequential military operations in the Western Hemisphere in decades, resulting in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores on charges including narco-terrorism and cocaine trafficking. The instinctive question people ask is, was this an act of war? From an intelligence standpoint, that is not the core issue. The real question is, what behavior has just been normalized and what does that mean for global competition in 2026? Venezuela is not just another regional flashpoint, it's a strategic inflection point. But to understand the significance of early 2026, we need to look back at operations that led up to it. Here, I'll talk about the timeline of US sanctions on Venezuela between 2014 to 2025. As you can see, over four administrations, there had been applying maximum diplomatic and political pressure to Venezuelan leadership. Obviously, with sanctions building over time through the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, now back into the Trump administration. Now, throughout late 2025, US counter-narcotics and security operations in the Caribbean and the northern coast of South America had already been steadily escalating. Maritime interdictions, air patrols, and intelligence pressure on illicit networks tied to Venezuela set the stage for rapidly expanding US activity in the region. But nothing in 2025 fully prepared the world for what unfolded on the night of January 3rd, 2026. In the early hours of that day, the United States launched Operation Absolute Resolve, a coordinated military strike combining air, land, and special operations forces into Venezuelan terrain. The mission targeted key military and security infrastructure in and around Caracas and culminating in the capture of Maduro and his wife. They were flown to the United States and arraigned on federal charges in Manhattan. President Trump quickly framed the operation as a law enforcement action against narco terrorism, justified under long standing indictments dating back to 2020. From the US perspective, this was a continuation of counter narcotic strategy, but at a strategic scale few anticipated. In Caracas and across Venezuela, the government labeled the operation as a blatant violation of sovereignty. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as the interim president amid state emergency declarations. International condemnation quickly consolidated, with major powers such as Russia and China calling for Maduro's release and denouncing the US action as aggressive and illegal under international law. This represented much more than a tactical strike. It was the first time in nearly 4 decades that a sitting head of state was apprehended by US forces and subjected to prosecution on US soil. What makes this event strategically significant is not just the capture itself, but under the frame in which it was conducted and justified. This was not declared as war. There was no UN mandate, there was no formal declaration of hostilities. Rather, it was presented as a law enforcement action, a continuation of counter narcotics policy, and a necessary strike against criminalized state leadership. This is exactly how the grey zone intervention looks at its most aggressive. Having a look at this, this is probably one of the best slides I've actually seen in regards to, or visuals in regards to, showing where the grey zone sits at the intersection of level of force being non-violent and violent versus civil to military vector actions. So, what we're talking about here is it encompasses diplomacy, information operations, peacekeeping operations, paramilitary forces, and within this environment, the grey zone, that we're talking about hybrid warfare dynamics and operations that can be conducted at different levels and different scales based on where it sits in the intersections and the red lines of a state. That brings me to the next slide. As you can see in the top right hand corner, you have peace versus war, so very black and white, and then you have the grey that sits in the middle in between, as well as the hybrid warfare actions that can be conducted throughout that. On the left, we have from top to bottom what would be considered at the top a normal escalation to war and then back down to peace. Okay, so that's a normal trajectory of what we would see in a conventional war sense and operations. However, when we look at the current geopolitical environment, we currently sit in a state of flux between that crisis and competition, which is essentially in the middle. And I think this visual really indicates that different states have different red lines and what they visualize and interpret as a state of conflict or a state of aggression, right? So when we look at this, one state in red might sit there and say, okay, this is where we sit on our level of where we think conflict will happen. Whereas a state that's different may have a less low threshold, which when you look at the bottom image, you can now see the area of misunderstanding or miscalculation that could happen within that could then exploit or could spark something new. And this has the potential to be one of those catalytic events that push other nations to sit there and say this is normalized behavior and acceptable on a on a global stage. The US can't really denounce what we're doing, so let's do XYZ. But just to give you a bit of an understanding and perspective on the fly of what it looks like. But when I go back to looking at this from an intelligence perspective, the importance lies in the behavior that is now normalized. We're talking direct military operations and actions against sovereign government without formal war declarations. We've got executive action without congressional approval, bypassing traditional checks and balances, external enforcement of domestic criminal charges against a foreign leader, public narrative framing as law enforcement rather than invasion. This shift in practice and in the narratives justifying it is quite profound. It suggests that powerful states now feel empowered to conduct unilateral kinetic operations under ambiguous legal frameworks, counting on legal, rhetorical, and operational cover rather than clear international backing. Venezuela is not strategically important for its own sake alone. It matters because it sits at the intersection of energy markets, regional influence, and great power competition. That brings me to my next slide, which is the expansion, as you can see, from the year 2000 to 2023 on who was the primary trading partner for South America. The US had a monopoly on trade throughout the region. However, progressively, over that 23-year period and leading into 2026, we see that over 80% of Southern America is now China being the preferred partner of choice for trade. And now when we look at this slide on Russia, we see the economic influence and we also see the military influence that they have in Venezuela. When we look at the economic and energy market, their oil production of 120,000 barrels per day in 2024 is quite significant. Additionally, as of the 1st of November, here, Russian senior lawmakers have considered putting supplying strategic weapons that we've just seen to Venezuela. These weapons include a missile system capable of deploying up to 6 nuclear warheads. We also see an anti ship missile system that can be used, which could essentially counter US operations and US naval assets within the region. And that's understandable that that's potentially assets that the US don't want within their region as they see that encroachment on military power. Now, when we talk about Venezuela, its oil reserves are among the largest in the world. What the United States demonstrated in January 2026 was not just its capability, but its willingness to act beyond traditional boundaries. If framed under criminality and counter narcotics, this sets a precedent with systemic implications. Other states with strategic resources may now be more vulnerable to similar framing. Powerful actors may extend this model beyond Latin America. Regional allies and rivals will be forced to reassess their assumptions about sovereignty, intervention, and legal justification. In short, the rules by which external force is applied and the narratives that justify it have shifted. As of early 2026, the strategic environment in the Western Hemisphere and beyond has changed. Now, Maduro and Flores remain in US custody facing prosecution. Venezuela is governed by an interim president under extreme internal pressure. You have regional institutions and global powers vocally contesting the legality and implications of the US operation. The broader trend we observe now is one where executive military action can be justified under non warlike rhetoric. Domestic prosecutions can serve as a pretext for foreign intervention. Strategic interests are pursued without traditional multilateral consent. This is the new baseline in 2026. In closing, what to watch for next? How international legal institutions respond or fail to respond. Whether similar framings are applied elsewhere, we're talking Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. How corporations reassess risk in resource rich contested states as well as in grey zone environments and with that consistent level of pressure throughout. And then how regional powers adjust their strategic postures. Because the question isn't whether Venezuela stabilizes, it's whether the behavior normalized there is replicated elsewhere. And that is the core of what we call the grey zone brief. If you found this analysis useful or insightful, please subscribe so you don't miss future briefings. And if you know somebody else making decisions in complex environments, share it with them. I'll see you in the next episode.